I still remember the sound of the waves that day, not the kind that soothe you to sleep, but the kind that mock you while you're wide awake. The family group chat had been buzzing for weeks. Matching outfits, deck parties, surprise engagement. But I wasn't in the photo plans, I wasn't in the conversation. 3 days before departure, I asked my father, half joking, half hoping, did I miss the invite, or am I just stowing away this time? He looked up from his espresso, barely blinking. You wouldn't like it. It's not your scene. And that was that. The morning of departure, I waited. Silly, isn't it? I packed a small bag, just in case. Then came the text from Mom. Don't take it personally. It's just for visuals. You understand, right? I didn't reply. I walked to the harbor anyway, watched the luxury ship gleaming and garlanded with banners pull away from the dock. I scanned the top deck. My sister waved wildly at someone beside her. My mother sipped champagne. My father posed for a photo. No one noticed me standing there. No boarding pass, no goodbye. Just me, a suitcase, and a growing silence. That day I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just stood still. It's strange what a single moment can do, not break you, not ruin you, but forge something inside you you didn't know was there. I turned away from the sea, not to run from it, but to learn how to own it. I landed in Miami with $212 and a chipped suitcase that had one working wheel. No plan, no one waiting. Just a strange calm in my chest. Not the kind that comes from confidence, but the kind you feel when you've already lost everything that used to define you. I found a motel near the docks, hourly rates mildew on the curtains, and a door that didn't quite lock, but it was mine. That first night I slept in my jeans, hugging my bag like a shield. Outside voices blurred with passing sirens. Inside, I stared at the ceiling and whispered to myself, "You're not broken, you're just starting." By day 2, I had a job bartending at a dockside bar that mostly served the night crew from passing ships. I didn't know how to make half the drinks, but I listened. I learned. The regulars tipped me in sea stories and folded bills. A retired engineer once said, "The ocean teaches you who you are and who you ain't pretending to be." I started staying late after my shift cleaning floors. No one asked me to, just to feel useful. But what I really waited for was quiet. Because in that quiet, I'd open my phone and start watching, not shows, not distractions, but videos, manuals, ship schematics, hours of nautical engineering tutorials, most of them meant for people who already had some kind of degree. I didn't, but I had something else: time, fire, and a picture. Taped to the mirror above the motel sink was the cruise ship that left me behind. Every time I doubted myself, I looked at it and whispered, "One day I'll see you again," but from the bridge. Some nights I crashed face first into my pillow without brushing my teeth. Some mornings I cried while lacing up my shoes. There was no grand montage, no cinematic victory, only small choices: choosing not to call home, choosing to show up at work, choosing to learn one new thing each night. And when I had saved enough to buy a used tablet, I enrolled in a free online course called Introduction to Maritime Propulsion Systems. Just the title gave me goosebumps. That's how it began. Not with someone discovering me, not with a lucky break, but with me alone choosing not to sink. They say hitting rock bottom teaches you who your real friends are. But what if you hit bottom and realize you're the only one left? Then you have two choices: float aimlessly or learn how to build. I chose to build. Maritime school wasn't glamorous. The floors smelled like salt and bleach, and the uniforms itched. I was the only woman in my class. Most of the men were ex-military sons of captains or lifelong sailors. I was the bartender girl with a borrowed backpack and second-hand boots. During the first week, someone said, "You sure you're in the right place? Engineering's not the hospitality track." He laughed. I didn't. There were no smiles for me in the beginning, no study groups, no one to share notes with. But I had already learned how to listen. So I watched how they solved problems, noted what books they left open on their desks, memorized the way they traced engine diagrams with their fingers. I knew I couldn't afford failure. I had no backup plan, no safety net. Each night after class, I'd walk 3 miles to a storage unit I rented for $49 a month. There was no AC, no light, just a battery lamp, a folding chair, and a wall covered in notes. The center of it all, that cruise ship photo, now pinned like a sacred vow. I would sit for hours with mechanical blueprints spread out like a map to some promised land. The silence was sharp, but so was my focus. I worked as a deckhand on the weekends, cleaning rust, tying knots, hauling cargo, whatever kept me close to the water. The men barked orders like I was invisible. Fine, let them. They didn't see the notebook in my back pocket, filled with diagrams, fuel equations, and questions for professors who barely remembered my name. Each test was a silent war, each pass a small rebellion. But nothing compared to the day we had our first simulation. The classroom's main engine panel, the same one used in real coastal vessels, was notoriously faulty. Everyone rushed through the checklist. I waited. Something felt off. One pressure reading was just wrong. I raised my hand. I think there's a coolant leak in the auxiliary system. They all stared. The instructor leaned in, checked, confirmed. No one clapped. No one congratulated me, but they didn't doubt me again. That night, I went back to the storage unit, opened a can of tuna, and stared at the ship photo. Not to dream anymore, but to plan. Because now it wasn't a fantasy, it was a possibility. I wasn't running from a family that left me behind. I was chasing something bigger than their approval. This wasn't about revenge. This was about reclaiming silence. They once used it to shut me out. Now I used it to sharpen myself. Every woman who's ever been told this isn't your place knows this feeling, the slow, quiet fire, the race no one knows you're running, the whisper, I'll show you. And I would, not through anger, not through posts, but through progress. 1 page, 1 bolt, 1 storm at a time. Storm simulations were always stressful, but this one felt real. The sky outside cracked open, lightning flashing through classroom windows like a bad omen. Inside the training vessel, our group prepared to run a full mock drill. The goal: navigate through a simulated storm scenario, identify engine risks, and stabilize systems. The crew in training buzzed with nerves, but also overconfidence. Everyone thought they were ready. 10 minutes in, the panel blinked. Power stuttered. The main generator lights flickered, then died. A cold silence filled the room. The simulation had just become something much closer to real. Panic took over. One trainee shouted, "What's protocol?" Another started flipping switches blindly. Someone bumped the emergency alarm, false trigger. The instructor, playing observer, watched without interfering. That's how they tested leadership, by leaving you alone with the chaos. I didn't speak, not at first. I crouched by the backup panel, ran through the emergency bypass codes in my head, checked the coolant valves, pressure wrong again, just like the simulation weeks ago. I gritted my teeth, turned 2 knobs clockwise, and tapped the auxiliary power breaker with the side of a wrench. Click, whir, light snapped back. The crew froze. I stood up, stabilize starboard flow, reboot the nav sensors before the system logs fail. Someone muttered, "How the hell did she know that?" I didn't answer. Not out of pride, just focus. By the time the instructor called drill, over half the room was still catching up. He walked over, stone-faced. "Miss Rivera," he said, "do you have prior sea time?" I shook my head. "No, sir, I've just studied a lot." He nodded once. "We'll be recommending you for the officer track." I thought I misheard. "Wait me." He smirked. "You stabilized an engine in crisis while your team froze. That's leadership." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded. My hands were still shaking when I got back to the locker room. Not from fear, from release. That night I got a call. A scholarship full ride was being offered through the local Maritime Corps. Accelerated program, limited spots. One of them was mine. I remember sitting on the edge of my cot, staring at my calloused fingers. I whispered, "We're not surviving anymore. We're sailing." That weekend, I walked to the edge of the pier where I used to bartend. The bar was still there, but I wasn't. I touched the railing and whispered, "Thank you to the sea." Not because it was kind, but because it was honest. It didn't care about your last name or your family. only whether you could hold the wheel steady when the storm came. And I had. For the first time, I wasn't chasing approval, I was answering a calling. Years passed, not in a blur but in quiet, deliberate chapters. I moved through the ranks like someone solving a long equation. From third officer to second, then senior officer. No fanfare, no press releases. I didn't post pictures, didn't tell my family. They assumed I was still drifting somewhere, maybe bartending in Belize or waitressing in Key West. It didn't matter. What mattered was this. I had become known, not loud, not famous, but known. Among crew circles, they whispered about the calm one. She doesn't shout, she doesn't panic, she listens. And I did, because I remembered what it felt like to be invisible. I treated the youngest deckhands with respect, taught the shy ones, trusted the stubborn ones. Once during a training voyage, a junior officer spilled hot coffee on the control panel. He froze in horror. The captain barked. Everyone panicked. I didn't raise my voice. I just handed him a rag, knelt beside him, and said, "Wipe fast. Then pull the breaker." It worked. The system recovered. He stared at me like I had just pulled him from a sinking ship. I smiled. Mistakes happen. What matters is how fast you recover. That became my style, and people noticed. One evening, I got called to the bridge for a private meeting. The fleet director was there. He didn't waste time. "We're offering you a command, not a training ship, a real one, passenger cruise international route." I blinked. "As captain." He smiled. "You've earned it." I went silent. He waited. When I finally nodded, I asked which ship. He replied, "The Seraphim, departing from Miami, destination Bahamas, then Cancun." The Seraphim. The same cruise line my family adored. The same class of ship they had once left me behind on. I went home that night, my quarters on base, still simple, and sat in front of the small framed photo of that old cruise. It was faded now, edges curled, but I kept it not out of spite, out of memory. I traced the ship's outline with my finger and whispered, "You left me on the dock." I climbed the sea. I packed with care, my captain's uniform pressed, hair tied back, not for approval, for clarity. I didn't feel revenge, just readiness. I boarded the Seraphim 3 days before departure to review systems protocols and crew assignments. I checked the passenger list as was standard procedure. That's when I saw them. My father, my mother, my sister, her fiancé, cabin A32, A33, and A34. I stared at the screen, not out of shock, but stillness. The sea really does bring everything back to you. Only this time I wouldn't be left behind. I'd be steering the whole ship. They always talked about full circle moments like they were romantic. This one felt surgical, clean, precise. Like fate had drawn a perfect line between then and now. I walked the corridors of the Seraphim 2 days before embarkation. Every hallway whispered memories not mine but imagined. What had they done the last time they boarded a ship like this? Laughed, toasted, taken family selfies, and told me I wouldn't like it. Now, every wall panel I inspected, every crew member I debriefed, every emergency drill I oversaw was mine. Responsibility, yes, but also a quiet ownership. I didn't tell anyone, not my colleagues, not my former instructors, not even the bartender at the marina who once loaned me her couch during hurricane season. The moment didn't need witnesses, just me and the sea. The morning of departure, I reviewed the manifest one more time. Cabin A32, father, A33, mother, A34, sister and fiancé. I stared at those lines for a moment longer than I needed to, then calmly closed the tablet. I didn't feel revenge bubbling in my chest. I felt wind. The same wind that had blown in my face the day they sailed away without me. Now it was behind me, not pushing me forward, just following quietly like a witness. The day of embarkation came with sun and applause. Passengers filtered through check-in. Crew escorted families to their cabins. Children ran past in sun hats chattering about ice cream. I boarded before everyone else, of course. As captain, I had final checks to sign off. My nameplate was already mounted in the bridge. Captain Rivera. Simple, clean. I stood tall on the upper deck, hands behind my back, scanning the crowd. And then, there they were, my family, stepping out of the shuttle, all designer sunglasses and wheeled luggage. My father was giving instructions. My mother was pointing toward the buffet signs. My sister was taking selfies, her fiancé trailing behind. They had no idea, not yet. I walked down the staircase and disappeared behind the crew corridor before they could look up. Timing was everything. 15 minutes later, as they handed their tickets to the staff at the gangway, a young crewman radioed in, then turned toward them with a polite smile. "Captain Rivera, your guests have arrived." Silence. My father blinked. My mother lowered her sunglasses slowly. My sister dropped her phone. There I was, standing at the top of the gangway in full white uniform epaulets gleaming under the morning sun. I didn't wave, didn't smirk. I just nodded the way captains do when they welcome strangers aboard. Because in that moment, that's exactly what they were. Their faces didn't change all at once. It was slow, like watching a storm approach over calm water. My father's jaw set tight. My mother blinked as if trying to wake from a dream. My sister's hands trembled, still hovering near her dropped phone. "Welcome aboard," I said evenly. "We're scheduled to depart at 4 p.m. I trust your cabins are in order." A junior steward stepped forward to take their bags. My mother flinched when he addressed me as captain. Not miss, not ma'am, captain. I turned away without waiting for a response. There were other guests, other duties, and I had a ship to run. Still, as I ascended the stairs back to the bridge, I caught glimpses of them through the tinted windows. Frozen, small, unsure whether to follow or flee. They followed, of course. Ego doesn't like an audience. Up on the bridge, I ran a final systems check with my officers. Radar clear, engine temp steady, passenger manifest complete. When the announcement bell chimed, I picked up the mic, voice steady, heart calm. "Good afternoon, guests of the Seraphim. This is your captain speaking. My name is Rivera. I'll be guiding you safely through our journey this week with stops in the Bahamas and Cancun. I invite you to relax, take in the sea air, and enjoy the voyage." The room burst into applause, except one section, 3 seats near the front, a man gripping his knees, a woman twisting her wedding ring, and a younger woman with downcast eyes and a phone she hadn't touched since the dock. I didn't smile, didn't make eye contact. I simply closed the mic and resumed my duties. Later that evening, I passed them in the lounge. My sister looked up. For a moment, her lips parted, but no words came out. I paused. Not long, just enough. And then I kept walking, because there was nothing to explain. They had made their choices years ago, now I was making mine. But the ship didn't care. It kept moving forward just like I had learned to do. At sea, the past doesn't anchor you, it just drifts farther and farther behind. I didn't avoid them, but I didn't seek them out either. That was the difference now. I no longer orbited their gravity. I had my own coordinates. Throughout the voyage, they appeared like background characters in a dream I had long since awakened from. My mother in the spa lounge looking over her shoulder. My sister wandering past the pool deck, her fiancé speaking too loudly behind her. My father, always in sunglasses, always pretending not to notice the glances from other passengers when they whispered, "That's the captain's family, isn't it?" But I didn't speak, didn't pull them aside, didn't give them the dramatic confrontation they might have imagined. I gave them something harder, silence. Every morning, I walked the deck, checked with the helmsman, briefed the crew, stood tall in the captain's chair where no one could place me beneath them. On the second day, we held the mandatory safety meeting for all passengers. I stood before hundreds of guests, microphone in hand, the Caribbean sun washing the deck in gold. My uniform crisp, my tone measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard. I am your captain for this voyage, Rivera. Safety is not just our responsibility, it's our commitment. In the event of an emergency, I will be the last to leave this ship." People clapped, some even stood. But in the third row, my family sat silent. Not because they didn't care, because they didn't know how to react. There was no script for this. Later, as guests lined up for photos with the crew, a little boy tugged his father's sleeve and pointed at me. "Is she really the captain?" The father smiled. "She's the one steering the whole ship, kiddo." I caught the boy's eyes, winked. And that small act, tiny wordless, felt like more than all the apologies I never received. Because in that moment, someone saw me not as someone's daughter, but as me. One night, I passed my mother sitting alone at the piano lounge. She looked up as I walked by. Her eyes searched for something, maybe guilt, maybe grace. But I kept walking. Some people want closure, I just wanted distance. Closure is a circle, but healing is a direction. And I was sailing in it. It happened on the fourth night. A polite note slid under my cabin door, sealed with the cruise line's official envelope. Inside, Captain Rivera, your father requests a private dinner at your convenience. Respectfully, Cabin A32. I sat with it for a long while. Not because I didn't know my answer, but because I wanted to make sure I chose it with intention, not emotion. That evening, I agreed. Not at a formal captain's table, not in public, just a quiet, tucked-away dining room near the rear of the ship. When I entered, he stood, wore a pale blue shirt like he used to on family vacations. Like this was just another trip. "Captain," he greeted, voice smooth. Too smooth. "Sir," I replied, "not Dad, not Father, just neutral air." We sat. The waiter poured wine. I didn't touch mine. He cleared his throat. I wanted to say, "You've done remarkably well, truly." Pause. "We may not have seen it at the time, but your determination, it's admirable." I nodded, polite, professional. "And your leadership," he continued. "Your name is being passed around in very impressive circles." Then the turn, it always comes. "We were wondering," he said gently, "since your sister's fiancé works in international shipping, perhaps you'd be willing to help him close a few business contacts, a few introductions, just open a few doors." I didn't react. I placed my fork down quietly, sat back, then asked one question. "If I weren't the captain, would you even remember I existed?" Silence. A long, awkward silence. He blinked. Once, twice, then reached for his glass, stalling. "Now that's not fair." "It's honest," I interrupted. "My existence was inconvenient, my ambition unflattering. You left me on a dock and called it not my scene." He looked away, stared at the linen napkin as if it held the right words. "I'm not angry," I added. "I'm just not available." He nodded slowly. "You're different now." "No," I said. "I'm exactly the same. You just finally ran out of ways to ignore it." I stood, smoothed my jacket. "Enjoy the rest of the cruise." As I turned to leave, he said softly, "Your mother cries about it, you know." I paused at the door, then without turning back whispered, "So did I," and walked away. The final night of the voyage was always my favorite. Not for the farewell dinners or deck parties, but for the quiet. When most guests were asleep and the ship hummed like a lullaby, I stood alone at the helm watching moonlight scatter across the waves like silver threads. It was the kind of stillness that reminded you you've made it, you're still here, and you're in control. I took out my recorder, just a simple voice memo, something I started doing during my earliest training nights, a habit I never broke. And I whispered, "They left me on shore. I built my own ship. They sailed away believing I had no direction, but I followed the stars they never bothered to look at. I didn't become this to prove them wrong. I became this to prove myself right." I closed the recorder and placed it gently back into my coat pocket. The next morning, the Seraphim pulled back into the Miami port. Golden light draped the deck as passengers prepared to disembark. My crew lined up smiling, nodding at the guests. Some stopped to thank us, others snapped last-minute photos. And then I saw them, my family, luggage in hand, eyes searching for, I'm not sure what. My mother tried to meet my gaze. My sister hesitated, then looked down. My father just kept walking. No words, no scenes, no "we were wrong" or "you made us proud." Just distance. And strangely, that was enough. Because I didn't need their recognition, not anymore. As the crowd thinned, I felt a small tug at my sleeve. I turned. A little girl with braids and a captain's hat much too big for her smiled up at me. "Are you really the captain?" she asked, eyes wide like the sea. I knelt down, adjusted her hat slightly. "Yes, honey," I said, voice soft but steady. "And you could be too." Her smile was all the validation I needed. She ran off to join her family, laughing as the wind caught her oversized hat. And I stood there watching, not waiting, not hoping, just steady. The wind picked up gently, brushing against my back, not pushing, not resisting. Just there, like a quiet witness. And as my silhouette faded into the mist of the early morning dock, I realized I wasn't chasing ships anymore. I was guiding them, and that was everything.